Hi, everybody. This is Deb. I hope you can hear me. According to the little icon on participants, I'm speaking, and it shows me speaking, so I hope that I'm coming through loud and clear. Today's a little bit unusual in the sense that I am presenting this webinar from a parking lot at the Vermont Teddy Bear Factory. I'm on the road today, and I was at the University of Vermont earlier, so if somewhere through this webinar I get approached by security and asked what in the world I'm doing with a laptop on my lap and a phone in my hand in their parking lot, then we'll just deal with that when the time comes. So, never having done this before, I look forward to the novelty. Anyway, welcome everybody. Today we're going to talk about CAEP's cross-cutting theme of diversity. And this is for anybody who is not doing a legacy visit, for people addressing the CAEP standards beginning in fall 2016 and beyond. For those people that have already submitted their self-study, this could be too much information, a little too late for you, but I hope that you'll find it interesting and you can use it in the future as you prepare for your CAEP visits. Webinar basics, this is kind of like theater previews of movies that are coming. And we have to do this piece. It's please mute your phones if you haven't muted them already. But remember to unmute when you want to talk. If you need to ask a question, put it on the Q&A. I have finally figured out how to have every question displayed that comes up on the Q&A piece. Or you can raise your hand. And I do have feedback and question pauses embedded throughout the presentation. And so I'll check on our attendees to see if anybody has a hand raised, and I will check on the questions that appear. So the recording of this webinar, and yes, I am recording, will be posted on the CAEP website by the end of the month at the latest. And if you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint, you can email me, and there's my email address, and I'm happy to provide that. Most of you also know my other email address, which is just deb.eldridge@gmail.com. Okay. So our goals today are not so different from what we've been doing as we address each one of the standards, but I hope that what we're going to do today is for you to be able to identify where the CAEP standards highlight diversity. For those of you who are familiar with accreditation with the former NCAEP standards, you'll notice that there is no diversity standard in CAEP as there was in NCAEP. However, diversity is embedded throughout the CAEP standards, and we'll talk about where those diversity pieces are in standards 1, 2, and 3, particularly. We'll also be listing the kinds of evidence that you can cross-tag from components to address diversity. So as we talk about where diversity exists in each standard and in each component of standards 1, 2, and 3, you can see that when you enter your evidence for those standards, you can also cross-tag that evidence as belonging to the cross-cutting theme of diversity. And then we'll talk a little bit about how you can respond to the holistic question about diversity. What is that question, and what are some things you can do to respond? So the first thing I want to talk to you about is what is the theme in the CAEP standards. This is called a cross-cutting theme. And it's because, and here's the wording straight out of the Commission report, that there were two areas that the Commission felt very strongly needed to be present throughout, integrated in the CAEP standards, and one of those was diversity. The other is technology, and that's something that we'll be talking about at the next webinar at the beginning of December. The Commission exactly says here that because diversity is an overarching feature of educator preparation, they're asking educator preparation providers to demonstrate in their self-studies how they've integrated diversity throughout their programs. And so although the CAEP standard, there is not a CAEP standard on diversity itself that calls out diversity, the expectation is, at this point in time, all educator preparation programs should be aware of the importance of addressing diversity and preparing candidates to teach to diversities that they have in their classrooms and in America's classrooms, and that those should be an integral part of every teacher preparation program. So that's the exact wording of the Commission here. Diversity must be a pervasive characteristic of any quality preparation program. And you're expected to ensure that candidates develop proficiency in specific aspects of diversity and embed diversity issues throughout all aspects of preparation courses and experiences. This is some of the language related to the cross-cutting theme of diversity that appeared in the original commission report, which can be found on the CAEP website, but it's also the language that you will find in the accreditation handbook as it addresses the cross-cutting themes. So let's talk for a minute here about the diversity proficiency. In the commission report, these are some of the diversity proficiencies that were highlighted in the report as examples of possible deficiencies, proficiencies, and prospective deficiencies, perhaps, if they're not part of your preparation program. So one of these is the incorporation of multiple perspectives. So when you're talking about content, including attention to learners' families and community experiences, cultural differences, you know, there are multiple perspectives through which any content can be examined. And this is the point, that we would have our candidates aware that there are multiple perspectives, and to incorporate multiple perspectives into discussions. That there might be a commitment to deepening their awareness about and understanding the strengths and needs of diverse learners, so that they can adjust instruction dependent upon what those needs and diversities are. And we know that students, there is ample evidence to show that students learn better when the content of instruction is made relevant and related to their lives. And so this is an important, perhaps, proficiency for you to consider. It also talks about verbal and nonverbal communication skills that will demonstrate respect for and responsiveness to differing cultural backgrounds and differing perspectives that students bring to the learning environment. So this is not just, do they know that children are different and they learn differently, but can they incorporate multiple perspectives? Can they adjust instruction for differences in student learning? And do they use both nonverbal and verbal communication skills that convey that respect for learners and their responsiveness to learner differences? Two more of these have to do with understanding, interpreting, sharing student assessment data with families, okay, that can support all students. And finally, to understand their own frames of reference and where their own personal biases may come in conflict with who their students are in their classrooms. And do they understand and can they acknowledge their own backgrounds as having an influence on their perspectives? So these are the diversities that were called out by the CAEP Commission. Does it mean that you have to incorporate these specific diversities as you talk about your cross-cutting themes? No, but it does say that you should have identified, or that, and chances are you have, if you were an NCAEP institution in the past, that part of your conceptual framework probably included diversity proficiencies. And that may be that some of those proficiencies you consider to be dispositions, and those are a part of the dispositions that you expect candidates to consider. And it may well be, if you were part of the TEAC institutions and putting together an inquiry brief in the past, maybe some of your claims related to your candidates' abilities to differentiate instruction based on learner differences. So just having a set of diversity proficiencies that you've identified is an important part of being able to respond to the cross-cutting theme, and an important part of being able to address diversity where it does appear in the CAEP standards. Now let me pause here for a minute and look at my questions and answers, and I don't see any questions coming up quite yet. And let me see the attendee list, and I don't see any hands raised. Okay, so let's give it a few minutes. If anybody would like to speak up, feel free. If so, unmute yourself before you do, or we won't hear you. Anybody with a question? Okay, then I'm going to move on. And the first thing we're going to do is look at, where does diversity appear in CAEP Standard 1? And this is the wording of the standard, that providers ensure that candidates develop a deep understanding and by completion are able to use discipline-specific practices flexibly to advance the learning of all students. When you find that language, learning of all students, learning and development of all P12 students, all P12 students learning and development, consider that an opportunity to demonstrate where your candidates are being prepared in terms of diversity of students. So here's a chart that talks about the diversity proficiencies that have been identified by the CAEP Commission, where those are relevant to the particular component, and where, if you have InTASC standards available to you, where in the InTASC standard diversity is considered an essential knowledge related to that component and to that proficiency, okay? So later, as I said, you can always ask me, email me to send you a copy of my PowerPoint slide, and that's where you can see this and have a copy of this. So the same proficiencies, which came out of page 29 of the Commission report, we talked them through. Multiple perspectives, understanding strengths and needs so you can adjust instruction, communication skills, assessment and sharing data with families, and their own self-knowledge. These are the components where that could be, those diversities could be shared. Component 1.1, which has to do with the InTASC categories, as you know, of content. So there's incorporating multiple perspectives and content. And the learners and learning, okay, which has to do with the second proficiency there, understanding strengths and needs of diverse learners in planning and adjusting instruction. And that can also apply to the InTASC category of instructional practice. So there are actually three bullets right here that could fill component 1.1 in 3 categories of the InTASC standards. Component 1.4 talks about preparing all students for access to career and college-ready standards, and I've aligned this communication skills of respect and responsiveness to that, because part of preparing all students for those standards that are college and career ready would be that communication ability. And if you have the EdTPA, it's a matter of academic language as well, and differentiating instruction for learners to have that access and provide that access. Assessment and data sharing with families is a part of component 1.2, which talks about candidates' use of research and assessment or evidence for both to improve both their students' learning and to improve their own professional practice. So that's where this particular component gives you also an opportunity to embed some diversity proficiencies in responding to that component. And then self-knowledge has to do with component 1.4, that's right, 1.4, because it talks about professional responsibilities. And 3.6, which is a selectivity at exit, talks about the professional responsibilities and ethics of their profession. And so that self-knowledge is a part of that. So you can tag any diversity proficiencies embedded in knowing oneself into either of those 2 components. Okay, so moving on, who are all students? As you remember, the language of this component was to advance the learning of all students. So when CAEP talks about all students, who are they talking about? And this is an important distinction about who's being addressed. It says children or youth attending P12 schools that are including but are not limited to students with disabilities or exceptionality, students who are gifted, who represent diversity based on ethnicity, race, socioeconomic status, etc. So this is a way for you to think about the variety of diversities that you could provide evidence related to, okay? It's an expanded definition from the CAEP definition of diversity. It's taken from the InTASC definition of diversity here to include students with exceptionalities, as well as gifted, as well as sexual identification and geographic origin. So I have it. Whoop, let me see. Yeah. Let me finish with the CAEP Standard 1, then I have a question pause because I do see a question that's come up, and I'm delighted. Okay, so what are some examples of the evidence that you could provide for diversity here? Well, one thing that is expected is a case study of the effectiveness of diverse field experiences on candidates' instructional practices. So let's say you have students that are out in the field with an observation, and then they're out in the field doing small group instruction, and then they're out in the field, and this is all prior to student teaching. The effectiveness of those diverse field experiences, what's the impact of those on candidates' instructional practices? Are they learning to recognize differences in learning, and are they able to, over the course of that sequence of field experience, differentiate their instruction? Are there opportunities for candidates to reflect on their personal biases and to build stronger relationships and to adapt their practices to meet the needs of each learner? So this could be perhaps an opportunity to show in, for example, a teacher work sample or a portfolio that they are reflecting, okay, on the ways in which their own perspectives are influencing their, let's say, judgments or their evaluations of student learning, that they can access appropriate resources, okay, and you could even, you know, build in some prompts if they aren't there about building stronger relationships with students and how are they reaching out to students to make connections with them that engage those students more in the classroom learning environment. And then there are certain forms of assessment that CAEP says could be offered as evidence of diversity for CAEP Standard 1, which are differentiated instruction based on group and subgroup results on either teacher-created or standardized assessment. So, for example, I know that the TPA and the PPAT also include sort of a pre and post on a group of students that have identified needs, okay, whether those are English language learners, students with special needs in the classroom, gifted students, high needs. These are all opportunities when you're perhaps responding to that CAEP Stand Component 1.2 on assessment and using assessment to inform instruction. You could also tag that to diversity. Okay. Here's my feedback question. I see I've got two here. So let me pull that bar over and say, so in our narrative, we will just call out evidence from other standards as having included the diversity elements, right? CAEP 1.1 requires, let me finish reading this, and it's not allowing me to finish reading this. Let's see if I can make the box bigger. Yeah, good. CAEP requires learner differences within, this is not cooperating. I see, yes. CAEP requires InTASC. Our field evaluations are aligned. For diversity, I'd mentioned, say, learner differences within that exhibit. Okay, so let me go back to that and say where I'm going to make some clarifications. In our narrative, you just call out evidence from other standards as having included the diversity elements. Well, you won't need to do that. You won't need to call out the evidence that includes diversity, because when you go, if you're doing the selected improvement or transformation initiative pathway, when you go to upload your evidence, you get to tag it right there as being related to particular components. You can also tag it at the same time as being related to diversity. So when you go to the part of the self-study where you are to address diversity, whatever you've tagged as being related to diversity will automatically show up on the screen for you. So you'll know exactly what pieces of evidence have been submitted, that you've tagged to diversity. So when you talk about it in the narrative, you don't have to go back and say, oh yeah, well, remember back in CAEP standard 1.1, we put in the blah, blah, blah. They know that already. You know that already because it's right there in front of you. So you know what you've tagged. When you talk about it in the narrative, it'll be only about the cross-cutting themes, and you'll say that responding to the holistic summary is, how have you integrated diversity across your preparation program? And you'll be able to say how you've done that based on the exhibits that you've tagged to diversity already. Does that clarify? I hope. Okay, so the next question. We have a couple of assessments that focus on diversity, but many that include aspects of proficiencies. You'd weave them together, right? Yes, I think that's a great idea. So you know that when you put in evidence examples, you could put in a standalone evidence example that is related only to the diversity cross-cutting theme, and you can tag it as such. So as put together a PDF where you've cut and pasted from the various places where diversity proficiencies are embedded and measured and assessed, and then explain all of that as part of the PDF narrative, like this is where these things appear, this is how we assess them, etc. If you present a data set, then you do that there as well. And when you go to write your narrative about how diversity is integrated across all your programs, that's where you'll be able to point to that specific example of evidence or any other that you've uploaded that sort of cross-reference with other components. I hope that's clear as well. So far, those are my two questions, and I hope they've answered. Let me know if I didn't answer that well, and let me move those questions out of the way. I'm going to move and see who our participants are in case we have any hands raised, and we don't. Okay. Let me get rid of that box, and let's move forward to Standard 2. Standard 2. Again, as I said, whenever you find all P12 students learning and development, think diversity. What you're trying to show here is that a result of your effective partnerships and your high-quality clinical practice, your candidates demonstrate that they have a positive impact on all students. So let's take a peek. Here's another chart on the diversity proficiencies that I shared earlier that came off the commission report, and the component in the standards that are relevant, and any InTASC standard related to performances. On the first slide, I showed you the essential knowledge because Standard 1 is content and pedagogical knowledge. Standard 2 has more to do with performances in Component 2.3. because Component 2.3 is that clinical practice and demonstrating that candidates have developed the knowledge, skills, and dispositions they need and can demonstrate having a positive impact on P12 students' learning and development. So here's where you would take advantage of the opportunity in Standard 2 to include diversity proficiencies that have been demonstrated during their field and clinical practice. So here's where diversity in Standard 2 in clinical experiences calls out diversity, that your clinical experiences are of sufficient depth, breadth, and diversity. So it's saying, do they only ever see one kind of school in one particular location, or are there a diversity given your local context? Do they have the opportunity to see other schools, other practices, other teachers, other ways of meeting students' needs? And lastly, that they demonstrate that positive impact on student learning and development. And so here you're wanting to show that through those diverse experiences, they have matured in their skills towards meeting diverse student needs. So what are some examples of evidence? Well, for component 2.1, you can show MOUs with a diverse range of P12 and community partners. You can demonstrate in component 2.2 the selection of diverse clinical educators. In component 2.3, you can show diversity of clinical settings and how those proficiencies that you've identified have been demonstrated with a diversity of partners, settings, and in partnership with school-based faculty, families, and communities. So what we want here is an opportunity for your clinical practices to be that field-based experience with a wide range, as wide a range as is practicable in terms of student learning needs, so that our candidates have that opportunity to develop skills in diverse settings. That's the point. Questions? I still only see the 2 questions that I've already addressed. And I see in our participants, no hands raised. So I'll just pause for a second here before we go on to diversity in standard 3. Oh, good. Yay, questions popping up. This is excellent. What is an MOU? You know, I get so used to acronym use, I figured just everybody just knows that. And I should know by now. To slow down a little bit. And before I use an acronym like that, explain. An MOU is a Memorandum of Understanding. And so it's one of the pieces of evidence that CAEP is suggesting could be provided for component 2.1 that shows you have those deep and mutually beneficial relationships with partner schools, is to submit as evidence copies of those Memorandum of Understanding, where you talk about your relationship with your partner schools, okay? Another question is, items from standard 1 and 2 might overlap. And that is absolutely true. Items from, I don't want this to scroll up. Maybe there's nothing more. Yes, items from 1 and 2 definitely may overlap. And that's the beauty of this in a way, because you know that you're limited to 90 pieces of evidence, okay? So it's helpful when what you're putting in standard 1 can also help in standard 2.3, can also be shown as one of your assessments to monitor candidate program progress through the programs for component 3.4, and can also be shown as an example of your quality assurance system for component 5.1. And tag it to diversity. So yes, we are hoping, or CAEP is expecting, that evidence can be used to fulfill, to address a variety of components. And so this is why it's a really good idea to sort of do an inventory of what evidence you have already, and then take a look at what's your most powerful pieces of evidence, the ones that would help you make a convincing argument, but that also would fulfill a number of components as you go through the self-study. All right, we're going to move on to the components in standard 3. And we're going to pause first on component 3.1. It is very explicit in saying what is your plan for recruitment of diverse candidates who meet employment needs. So there's the language in that component has to do with recruiting them and then supporting them to completion, that the candidates that you're recruiting will provide you with a pool of candidates that come from a broad range of backgrounds and diverse populations. And it suggests that the admitted pool reflects the diversity of America's P12 students. So we have a variety of contexts in which educator preparation is delivered, some contexts that are extremely diverse, some contexts which are less diverse if we look at diversity with a narrow lens. So what CAEP is asking for here is that you determine that your recruitment plan is an active one and that you're seeking to diversify the pool of candidates that you could admit to. So your recruitment plan may be targeting candidates who speak languages other than English. It may be targeting men to come into early childhood and elementary fields. It may be targeting women, women of color, men of color to come into STEM fields. So your recruitment plan is targeted in two areas. One, to get more diverse candidates, both in terms of the programs that they're entering as well as the total pool, and also to be addressing those employment needs in your region. And so, for example, I've been at universities that have a great need for candidates to teach in rural, more remote rural locations, and that there's a tremendous turnover in those locations. And so your recruitment plan might be trying to address candidates who would teach in these hard-to-staff schools, who will supply for the shortage areas that your state may have identified, who may themselves be students from these rural locations, okay, who may not be attending college, who may be first-time college attenders. So there's a number of ways to think about this, and I hope that as you put together your plan, your recruitment plans, you'll really be thinking about what the needs are, both locally, regionally, as well as nationally. So, examples of evidence of diversity for CAEP Standard 3 are specifically in terms of needs to serve increasingly diverse populations, and evidence of marketing and recruitment at high schools and colleges that are racially and culturally diverse. There's a tremendous need nationally for more teachers of color to enter teaching and stay in teaching. And so any outreach that we do in that area and any increase in the diversity of the candidates that come into our programs is addressing that national need. And it really is something for us to think deeply about how we can do that, particularly if our campuses are not particularly diverse in terms of ethnicity, race, or culture. Then that's going to be a particular challenge for us, but there needs to be an active recruitment plan in place. All right, any questions or comments up to now? It's just a little after 5:30, and we're mostly through this webinar. We've talked about what diversity is. We've talked about where diversity specifically appears in Standards 1, 2, and 3. Good question. Excellent. Yay, a new question. Does it matter what duration the field experiences are to justify a diverse setting, short-term versus long-term? No, CAEP doesn't make that that kind of demand. However, the wording of the clinical practice is it of sufficient breadth and depth and duration, okay, to have, for candidates to be able to develop their skills, their knowledge and skills. So I know that there are campuses that take students on a one-day visit to an urban school or an urban setting, and there's actually research evidence that to do that kind of thing, if it's a one-day experience, it does more to confirm biases than it does to break them down. So something of longer duration would be preferable over the sort of one-day, one-shot deal. And so something to consider. We really don't know, I don't think, if we're not in locations where there's a lot of diversity. I'm not sure what evidence, research evidence there is to say, well, you need to have an experience that's X amount long. What I have read is that the important thing is that the candidates have an opportunity to engage with students who are unlike themselves, okay? So engagement could be a once a week, after school program perhaps in a tutoring situation, could be, a 2 to 3 to 4 weeks in a particular classroom setting, maybe 1 day a week. You'll have to think for yourselves about what those possibilities are and who you might be able to partner with to make that happen. I think we've got to think creatively about this, and it's one of the things that the CAEP Commission pointed out, is that we've got tremendous need to prepare teachers for all kinds of diversity, although they may be, you may be primarily training or preparing your candidates for teaching locally, but there's no guarantee really that they're not going to at some point, move within the state or move to a bigger city or move to a different state altogether. And so providing the candidates with some skill set for addressing diversity and differentiating instruction, having some strategies to do that and having an opportunity to utilize those strategies is what CAEP is getting at, so that they can develop them. It's one thing to know, to hear, oh, well, you could do this or that. It's quite another thing to be in a classroom and have students that need those diverse strategies and knowing, here's where I can employ that strategy, and then see if that's improving the learning of the students that are in front of you. So I think that duration question is one we have to answer for ourselves. And perhaps the best way to do that is to implement an innovation, track it over time, and see if it's doing what we hope it's doing. And if it's not, then it's time to think of a new way to approach the issue. Could engagement, let me scroll it down here. Could engagement be a research project consisting of a community mapping activity if we can't get candidates out to highly diverse schools? Well, I think that it's something you could do that is better than lots of other things that could be done, and probably not quite as effective. But if you're doing a community mapping activity, I would take the opportunity to say, okay, what impact is this community mapping activity actually having on candidates? I mean, what does it make a difference to them? And if so, how? What did they learn? And because I don't think we know, maybe the community mapping activity is something that gets them to really deeply reflect on their own community experiences and how those are similar or different to the community mapping activity. So it would get to that self-knowledge and that reflection and the development of, professional responsibility. Would it get to their ability to differentiate instruction? Maybe not. But if you did have them differentiating instruction for the kinds of diversity that do exist locally, like there's probably students from high or low performing students that need some differentiation. There may be socioeconomic. There's quite a bit of research out there, primarily by Haberman, about children with poverty and some of their needs in the classroom. So there may be opportunities to differentiate for a particular population of students that could then be generalized. Maybe there's some strategies there that you could say, these would also apply in these other contexts. Again, the reflective piece, definitely, but this, now I'm not going to speak as a CAEP person, but as a former professor and dean, I found that many of the reflective pieces that I've read in the past have not been particularly deep by students. They tend to be sort of superficial in terms of the reflection. Oh, I did this and that, and the kids seem to really enjoy the activity, and I think they learned because most everybody was able to. Well, that's not quite the level of reflection that we want. So if you're considering including reflective pieces, think a little bit about how those can be rigorous reflection. Okay? Okay. Let's see. And I think that's all my questions so far. Okay. So what's the holistic question? And how do we respond to it? Here's what the holistic question is. Analyze the evidence that demonstrates diversity integration. That's it. So when you get to that part of the self-study, that bolded piece is all you're going to see. What's your analysis of the evidence that demonstrates diversity integration? So how you're going to go about responding to that is that hopefully by now, when that pops up on your screen to answer that question, you're going to see exactly what you've tagged as relating to diversity. And the information is going to be provided from several sources, and it does provide evidence of diversity being integrated, and that you're going to analyze that data. What is this data really showing you? What sense do you make of it? If you just pull out the diversity pieces, is it showing to you that your candidates are demonstrating the proficiency that you hope they're demonstrating, that you hope they're getting in your programs? So you're looking for trends, you're looking for patterns, you're hopefully reaching some appropriate conclusions. And based on the evidence, you're saying to yourself, you know, perhaps it seems that our candidates are really aware of diversity and they're able to identify different kinds of diversity and they're able to talk about differentiating instruction, but the evidence is not showing us that our candidates are as adept as they need to be at using assessment information and to interpret assessment information in a way that allows them to improve their instruction so that all students can learn. If you find by looking at your evidence that there's a particular area of weakness, CAEP is saying call that out and talk about the last bullet, whatever your planned actions are for change. So what are you going to do about that? Okay, and that you're describing that to CAEP. You're not going to be dinged in your accreditation review if you identify an area that needs improvement as a result of the analysis that you're doing on the evidence that you've presented and say, wow, you know, it looks like there's a real need for this. Or maybe it's particular to a couple of programs, that some programs seem to be stronger in the diversity outcomes, and some not so strong. So what is that telling you? What sense are you making of that, and what do you intend to do about it? Okay, what are the reviewers going to look for? Reviewers are going to determine whether you sufficiently address the theme in the self-study, but the theme is not a standard. And so it is not judged by the visiting teams as a standard. So what does that mean? It means they're not going to cite stipulations or weaknesses. They're not going to say, you know, this is weak here. But what they are going to do is if there are questions that get raised by looking at your diversity integration, your cross-cutting theme, if they look at that and they go, wow, that makes me think I need to go back and look at what's being done in terms of diverse clinical placement. So red flags or flag areas may be raised as they read your component, and that may cause them to go back into the standards. But as a whole, the diversity cross-cutting theme is not judged as a standard, so you can't fail your cross-cutting theme of diversity. But it could raise red flags to the visitors that cause them to go back and look more deeply at some of the things, some of the components that address diversity, and look a little deeper. Final feedback and question pause. Folks, it's 5:45. We've been at this for 45 minutes. And unless there are other questions, this is pretty much it. I'm going to share the next step slide with you. We've got two more webinars in 2015. There's the cross-cutting theme of technology on December 3rd, and there's aligning and tagging your evidence on December 15th. And after that, the webinars are over in terms of my presenting them. There'll be a new series of webinars starting in January It'll be presented by Margie Crutchfield. Okay, so now I've got a new question. I love these questions, people. Keep them coming. Does a community agency partner with deeper engagement like literacy groups, arts integration, and recreational leads also pertinent to diversity settings for CAEP evidence? Yes, I would think it would be, absolutely. Because it does say in the CAEP components that school or community partners, and so I would say yes. If you can take advantage of other settings where diverse students are being brought together and you can have your candidates engage with them at some level, whether it's in arts integration or recreational leads or whatever, they have an opportunity to be with diverse students and interact with them and engage with them in a context appropriate to their preparation? Absolutely. Tailor-made for this, so go for it. Anybody else? Okay, let me scroll back down through the questions, make sure I got them all. Yep. According to my Q&A here, I have gotten all of your questions answered. Great. Somebody put in, well, this is timely. We're submitting our self-study in January. Well, good. I hope it is timely, and I hope I've given you some helpful hints. If you have additional questions, please, feel free to email me. Again, there are two email addresses. One is capital L, capital C, capital V, Inc., I-N-C, and the number 1 at gmail.com. Or you can send it to deb.eldridge@gmail.com, and I'll send you my PowerPoint and anything else. And somebody put, we know where to find you. Yeah, I bet you do. If you're one of my frequent flyers here at the webinars, you know where to find me, and I'm happy to send you my PowerPoint. So, folks, it's been great. Let me pull over my attendees here and see if anybody had a hand raised. Nope. Not a one yet. I'm going to sign off here in a very few minutes, but I'll hang out in the meantime in case anybody has a direct question and just didn't want to be in front of the whole universe there. Together? No, we're done. Okay, down to just a few people. Let's see here. Did something come up on the chat? Somebody said, who was here earlier, who I said I was broadcasting from the parking lot of the Vermont Teddy Bear Company because I've been at the University of Vermont all day today. It's a good thing I didn't freak out security. And no, in fact, no security officer has been by to say, what is this person doing in a car with a laptop on her lap and a telephone in her hand? And sadly, in this day and age, that can be a red flag for sure. Okay, folks, I'm going to discontinue our webinar. See you, hopefully, for Cross-Cutting Team Technology. I'll basically approach it in the same way I did this one. See you then. Bye-bye.